Michelle Carter had always been someone who believed in hard work. From a young age, she learned that nothing came easy, especially not success. Growing up in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of town, Michelle often watched her mother juggle 2 jobs just to make ends meet. But even as a child, Michelle dreamed big. She wanted to create something meaningful, something that would not only help her family but also uplift her entire community. Years later, Michelle turned that dream into reality. With grit and determination, she built her own catering business, from scratch. Starting with nothing more than a rented kitchen and a few recipes passed down from her grandmother, Michelle worked tirelessly. She spent long nights perfecting her dishes and even longer days knocking on doors, trying to convince event planners to give her a chance. Slowly, but surely, her efforts paid off. Word spread about her delicious food and exceptional service, and soon Michelle's catering became one of the most sought-after companies in the city. But Michelle wasn't just focused on making money. For her, the business was about giving back. She hired people from her neighborhood, many of whom struggled to find stable jobs, and trained them to become skilled chefs and servers. She also donated meals to local shelters and schools, ensuring no one went hungry if she could help it. Her customers loved her not just for her food but for the heart behind it. Michelle was proof that success didn't have to come at the expense of kindness or integrity. On this particular morning, Michelle woke up early like she always did. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as she loaded trays of freshly baked pastries and steaming hot meals into her van. Today was a busy day. She had 3 events lined up: a corporate luncheon downtown, a wedding reception in the suburbs, and a birthday party for a little girl whose parents had saved up months to afford her services. Michelle smiled as she thought about how much joy food brought to people's lives. It wasn't just sustenance, it was connection, celebration, and love all rolled into one. As she drove through the quiet streets, humming along to the radio, Michelle felt grateful. Life hadn't been easy, but she had made it this far. Her business was thriving, her employees were happy, and her community respected her. Everything seemed to be going well, until she reached the intersection near downtown. The light turned red and Michelle stopped behind a line of cars waiting patiently for their turn. Just then, she noticed a police car pull up beside her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Police cars were a common sight in the area, and Michelle assumed the officer was simply patrolling the neighborhood. But when the officer glanced at her, his expression changed. He stared at her intently, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were studying her. Then, without warning, he flicked on his sirens and motioned for her to pull over. Confused, Michelle obeyed. She carefully guided her van to the side of the road, her mind racing. Had she done something wrong? She replayed the last few minutes, in her head, trying to figure out what might have caught the officer's attention. She hadn't been speeding, she was sure of that. She signaled properly, stayed within the lines, and followed every rule of the road. So why was she being pulled over? When the officer approached her window, Michelle rolled it down and greeted him with a polite smile. "Good morning, officer," she said warmly. "Is everything okay?" The officer didn't return her smile. Instead, he leaned closer, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Do you know how fast you were going?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer, or rather, the lack of one. Michelle shook her head calmly. "I don't believe I was speeding, sir," she replied. "I've been driving carefully all morning." The officer chuckled, a cold, dismissive laugh that sent a chill down Michelle's spine. "Of course you wouldn't know," he said, his words laced with sarcasm. "You're probably too busy counting your welfare checks to pay attention to speed limits." The comment hit Michelle like a punch to the gut. She froze for a moment, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. When the weight of his words sank in, anger began to simmer inside her. How dare he assume things about her based on the color of her skin? She had worked hard for everything she had, and here was this man reducing her to a stereotype. Despite the rage bubbling beneath the surface, Michelle forced herself to stay calm. Losing her temper wouldn't solve anything. It might even make the situation worse. Instead, She took a deep breath and handed over her license and registration, hoping the officer would see there was no reason to detain her further. But instead of quickly checking her documents, he lingered, examining them as if searching for some hidden flaw. "Nice car," he remarked after a while, his tone still mocking. "Does it belong to you, or did you borrow it from someone?" Michelle clenched her fists under the steering wheel, her nails digging into her palms. Every fiber of her being wanted to snap back, to tell him exactly how insulting his questions were. But she bit her tongue and nodded. "Yes, it belongs to me," she said firmly. "I use it for my catering business." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Catering business, huh?" he muttered, glancing at the logo printed on the side of the van. "Looks pretty fancy for someone like you." By now, other drivers had started to notice the interaction. Some slowed down as they passed, craning their necks to get a better look. A few honked their horns impatiently, frustrated by the delay caused by the traffic stop. One woman in a nearby car shook her head disapprovingly, mouthing the word racist as she drove by. Michelle saw it all, but she kept her eyes fixed on the officer, refusing to let him see how much his words hurt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer handed back her documents. "Be careful out there," he said curt calls, his tone dripping with insincerity. Then, without another word, he returned to his patrol car and sped away, leaving Michelle sitting alone by the curb. For several moments, Michelle didn't move. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined not to cry. This wasn't the first time she'd faced racism, and it probably wouldn't be the last, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. What made it worse was knowing that the officer's actions weren't just about her. They were part of a larger pattern of discrimination that affected countless others like her. Eventually, Michelle wiped her face, took a deep breath, and started the engine again. She couldn't afford to dwell on the encounter, not with 3 events waiting for her and dozens of customers depending on her to deliver their meals on time. Still, as she drove away from the intersection, she vowed silently to herself that this wouldn't be the end of the story. Somehow, some way, she would make sure the officer and the system he represented paid for what they had done. Little did Michelle know, this single moment of injustice would set off a chain reaction that would change not only her life but also the lives of everyone connected to that police precinct. And as she navigated the streets of the city, delivering food and spreading joy, she couldn't shake the feeling that bigger things lay ahead. After delivering all her orders that day, Michelle returned home exhausted, but not just from the physical work. The encounter with the officer weighed heavily on her mind, replaying itself over and over like a broken record. She sat in her living room, staring at the wall, unable to shake off the feeling of humiliation and anger. Her hands trembled as she held a cup of tea, though she barely noticed it. For years, Michelle had faced subtle forms of discrimination, comments about her accent, assumptions that she couldn't afford certain luxuries, or being followed around stores by security guards who thought she might steal something. But this time was different. This wasn't just an offhand remark or a suspicious glance. It was outright mockery disguised as authority. It was personal, calculated, and meant to demean her. And worst of all, it came from someone whose job was supposed to protect and serve everyone equally. Michelle tried to distract herself by watching TV, scrolling through social media, or even calling a friend to vent. But no matter what she did, the memory of the officer's sneering face lingered. His words echoed in her ears. "Too busy counting your welfare checks." They weren't just hurtful. They were designed to strip away her dignity, to remind her of the stereotypes people like him clung to so desperately. Michelle knew she hadn't earned her success because of handouts or shortcuts. Every achievement, every milestone, had been the result of blood, sweat, and tears. Yet here was this man dismissing her hard work in seconds. The more Michelle thought about it, the angrier she became. Was this how other Black people felt when they interacted with law enforcement? How many others had been treated the same way, or worse? The thought made her sick to her stomach. She couldn't stand the idea of staying silent while injustice continued unchecked. Something inside her snapped. Enough was enough. Determined to do something, Michelle grabbed her laptop and started typing furiously. First, she wrote down everything she remembered about the traffic stop. The officer's badge number, his patrol car's license plate, the exact words he said. Then, she filed a formal complaint with the police department, attaching copies of her notes and even screenshots of witnesses who had posted about the incident online. As she clicked submit, Michelle felt a small sense of relief, but deep down she knew it wouldn't be enough. Complaints like hers rarely led to meaningful consequences. Officers accused of misconduct often walked away scot-free, protected by their colleagues or buried under layers of bureaucracy. That realization only fueled Michelle's determination further. If the system refused to hold itself accountable, then she would have to expose it herself. She began researching public records, looking for any evidence of similar incidents involving the precinct where the officer worked. At first, the process was frustrating. Government websites were clunky and difficult to navigate, and some documents required fees to access. But Michelle didn't give up. Late into the night, she scrolled through pages of reports, court filings, and news articles, piecing together a disturbing pattern. What she uncovered shocked her. Over the past decade, dozens of complaints had been filed against officers from the same precinct, all alleging racial profiling, excessive force, or verbal abuse. Some cases involved brutal beatings caught on camera. Others described families torn apart during wrongful arrests. In one instance, a teenager was tased multiple times simply for questioning why he was being stopped. None of these cases had resulted in serious punishment for the officers involved. Instead, settlements were quietly paid out to victims, and the incidents disappeared from public view almost as quickly as they occurred. As Michelle dug deeper, she found lawsuits naming the precinct as a defendant. One lawsuit claimed that supervisors routinely ignored reports of misconduct, encouraging a culture of impunity among their ranks. Another revealed that internal investigations were often conducted by fellow officers, creating conflicts of interest that skewed outcomes in favor of the accused. The more Michelle read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about an entire system designed to shield wrongdoing. By morning, Michelle's eyes were red and puffy from lack of sleep, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She printed out every document she could find, organizing them into folders labeled with dates and names. She highlighted key passages and scribbled notes in the margins, connecting dots that others had missed. By the time she finished, she had amassed a mountain of evidence pointing to widespread corruption within the precinct. But Michelle knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. She needed help from people who understood the legal system, from activists who could rally support, and from journalists who could shine a spotlight on the issue. So she reached out to everyone she could think of. First, she contacted a local lawyer named Marcus Reed, known for taking on civil rights cases pro bono. When Marcus heard Michelle's story and saw the evidence she'd gathered, he agreed to represent her immediately. "This is huge," Marcus said, flipping through the folders. "If we play our cards right, we can bring this whole thing crashing down." Next, Michelle reached out to community leaders and activists. She attended meetings, shared her findings, and listened to stories from others who had suffered at the hands of the same precinct. Many were hesitant to speak publicly, fearing retaliation, but Michelle assured them she wouldn't stop until justice was served. Slowly but surely, a coalition began to form, a group of determined individuals united by a common goal. Finally, Michelle approached a journalist named Sarah Collins, who wrote for a major newspaper in the city. Sarah had covered police brutality cases before and was eager to investigate Michelle's claims. Together, they planned a series of exposés that would lay bare the truth about the precinct's misconduct. Sarah promised to dig even deeper, interviewing former officers, whistleblowers, and victims willing to come forward. With her team assembled, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose. For weeks, she worked tirelessly alongside Marcus, Sarah, and the activists, strategizing and preparing for the next step. They decided to hold a press conference outside the precinct, inviting members of the media to hear firsthand accounts of systemic racism and abuse. Flyers were distributed throughout the city, urging residents to attend and share their experiences. Social media buzzed with anticipation as word spread about the upcoming event. On the day of the press conference, hundreds of people gathered outside the precinct holding signs that read, "Justice for all and no more corruption." Reporters from local and national outlets lined up with cameras and microphones, ready to capture every moment. Michelle stood at the center of it all, flanked by Marcus, Sarah, and several survivors of police misconduct. As she stepped up to the podium, her heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "My name is Michelle Carter," she began, looking directly into the crowd. "And I'm here today because I refuse to let racism and abuse go unpunished. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident, it's part of a much larger problem. But together, we can demand accountability and create real change." The audience erupted in applause, cheering loudly as Michelle spoke. One by one, others took the stage, sharing their own harrowing stories of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Each testimony added weight to the growing call for reform. By the end of the conference, the message was clear. The people were tired of being ignored, and they were ready to fight back. Within hours, videos of the press conference went viral, sparking outrage across the country. Protesters flooded the streets outside the precinct, chanting slogans and demanding answers. Politicians issued statements condemning the department's actions, while celebrities used their platforms to amplify the movement. What had started as a single act of defiance by Michelle had grown into a full-blown uprising, one that would soon force the powers that be to reckon with the truth. As Michelle watched the chaos unfold from her living room window, she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, but for the first time in days, she felt hopeful. She had turned pain into power, shame into strength, and silence into action. And she knew this was only the beginning. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind for Michelle. Overnight, her name became synonymous with courage and resilience. People across the city, and even beyond, were talking about her. Social media was flooded with hashtags, like Stand With Michelle and Justice for All, as supporters shared videos, photos, and messages of solidarity. News outlets couldn't get enough of the story. A black businesswoman standing up to a corrupt police precinct, exposing years of hidden injustices. For many, Michelle represented hope, a symbol that ordinary people could still make a difference. But fame came with its own set of challenges. Almost immediately after the press conference, Michelle started receiving threatening phone calls and messages. Some accused her of lying or exaggerating. Others made racist slurs, telling her to go back where she came from. A few anonymous texts warned her to drop the case if she valued her safety. At first, the threats terrified her. She double-checked the locks on her doors every night and avoided going out alone. But as the attacks continued, something shifted inside her. Instead of letting fear control her, Michelle channeled it into determination. If anything, the backlash only strengthened her resolve to keep fighting. Meanwhile, the pressure on the police department grew exponentially. Protesters camped outside the precinct day and night, refusing to leave until changes were made. Local businesses donated food and supplies to support them, while musicians and artists performed to boost morale. The scene was electric, a mix of anger, passion, and unity. Every time Michelle visited the protest site, she felt overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding her. Strangers hugged her, thanked her, and promised to stand by her side no matter what happened next. Behind the scenes, Michelle worked tirelessly with Marcus, Sarah, and the activists to build their case against the precinct. They combed through thousands of pages of documents, piecing together a timeline of misconduct that stretched back decades. Former officers who had left the department under mysterious circumstances agreed to testify, revealing shocking details about toxic leadership and cover-ups. One whistleblower described how supervisors would destroy evidence of wrongdoing or tamper with body camera footage to protect their colleagues. Another recounted being pressured to meet arbitrary quotas for arrests, regardless of whether those arrested were actually guilty. As the investigation progressed, Michelle realized just how deep the rot went. It wasn't just one bad apple, or even a handful. It was an entire system designed to shield abuse and perpetuate inequality. Officers routinely targeted Black and brown communities, using minor infractions as excuses to harass and intimidate. Innocent people were dragged into custody, sometimes beaten or humiliated simply because they fit a certain profile. Families were torn apart, lives ruined, all while the perpetrators walked free, protected by their badges. Sarah's exposés began appearing in the newspaper, each article more damning than the last. The first piece focused on Michelle's traffic stop, detailing the officer's offensive comments and linking them to a pattern of discriminatory behavior. The second revealed the lawsuits filed against the precinct, highlighting the millions of taxpayer dollars spent on settlements over the years. Subsequent articles delved into specific cases of brutality, featuring interviews with victims and their families. Readers were horrified by what they learned, flooding the paper's comment section with demands for accountability. City officials, unable to ignore the mounting public outrage, finally took action. Under intense scrutiny, they announced an independent investigation into the precinct's practices. A team of auditors, lawyers, and community representatives was assembled to review policies, interview staff, and examine records. For the first time in years, there was real hope that justice might prevail, but not everyone welcomed the investigation. Within the precinct, tensions ran high. Officers grumbled about witch hunts and complained that they were being unfairly targeted. Some threatened to quit, claiming they couldn't do their jobs properly without facing accusations of racism. Others doubled down on their abusive tactics, seemingly determined to prove the investigators wrong. Meanwhile, union leaders launched a PR campaign to defend their members, arguing that most cops were good people doing difficult work in dangerous conditions. Michelle knew better than to fall for these arguments. She understood that systemic racism wasn't about individual intentions. It was about structures and systems that allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked. Still, she couldn't deny the toll the fight was taking on her personally. Running a business while leading a movement was exhausting, and there were days when Michelle wondered if she was biting off more than she could chew. Orders for her catering company piled up, forcing her to juggle late-night meetings with early morning deliveries. Her employees noticed the stress etched on her face and offered to help however they could, but Michelle insisted on carrying the burden herself. After all, this wasn't just her battle. It belonged to everyone affected by injustice. One evening, as Michelle sat at her kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers and empty coffee cups, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "We've got him," it read. Confused, Michelle called him immediately. "Got who?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. "The officer who pulled you over," Marcus replied. "His name is Officer Greg Dawson. Turns out he's been suspended twice before for similar incidents involving Black drivers. Both times the complaints were dismissed due to lack of evidence. But this time, we have witnesses, video, footage, and his own words on record. He's toast." Michelle let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. For months, she had dreamed of this moment, the moment when justice would finally catch up to the man who had mocked her so cruelly. But instead of feeling triumphant, she felt conflicted. Was punishing one officer enough? Would firing him, or even arresting him, really change anything? Or was it just a band-aid solution, masking the deeper problems lurking beneath the surface? The next morning, news broke that Officer Dawson had been placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. Protesters cheered the announcement, celebrating it as a victory, but Michelle remained cautious. She knew the real battle was far from over. Firing one bad cop wouldn't dismantle the system that enabled him to act with impunity in the first place. Real change required more than accountability. It required reform. Determined to push forward, Michelle organized a town hall meeting to discuss potential solutions. Hundreds of residents packed into the local community center, eager to share their ideas and concerns. Teachers spoke about the need for better education programs to combat bias among young people. Parents demanded stricter oversight of law enforcement agencies. Activists proposed defunding the police and reallocating resources to social services like mental health care and housing assistance. Each suggestion sparked lively debates, but one thing was clear. The community wanted action, not empty promises. By the end of the meeting, Michelle had compiled a list of concrete demands to present to city officials. Among them were calls for mandatory anti-racism training for all officers, the implementation of civilian review boards to oversee misconduct investigations, and increased transparency in disciplinary proceedings. She also advocated for hiring practices that prioritize diversity and inclusivity, ensuring that the police force reflected the demographics of the community it served. Armed with these proposals, Michelle met with the mayor and other key decision-makers. At first, they were reluctant to commit to such sweeping reforms, citing budget constraints and logistical challenges. But Michelle refused to back down. With Marcus by her side, she presented data showing how investing in reform now would save money in the long run by reducing lawsuits and improving public trust. When the officials hesitated, she reminded them of the protests outside the precinct and the cameras rolling just steps away. "We're giving you a chance to do the right thing," Michelle said firmly. "If you don't take it, we'll find someone who will." Her words struck a nerve. Reluctantly, the officials agreed to consider the proposals, promising to release a detailed plan within weeks. Though Michelle knew the road ahead would still be rocky, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of optimism. Change was slow, messy, and often painful, but it was possible. And as long as she kept pushing, kept fighting, she believed they could create a future where no one else had to endure what she had. That night, as Michelle lay in bed, she thought about everything that had happened since that fateful traffic stop. What began as a personal insult had grown into a movement capable of challenging one of the most powerful institutions in the city. She smiled to herself, knowing that her journey was far from over. But for the first time, she truly believed they could win. The weeks following the town hall meeting were a blur of activity for Michelle. City officials had promised to consider her proposals, but promises weren't enough. Michelle knew that without constant pressure, those ideas might vanish into thin air. She didn't trust bureaucrats to follow through on their own. She'd seen too many empty gestures masquerading as progress. So, she kept pushing. Every day, she organized rallies, sent emails, made phone calls, and met with anyone who could help turn her demands into reality. Her determination became infectious, inspiring others to join the fight. Slowly but surely, changes began to take shape. The mayor announced the creation of a civilian review board tasked with overseeing police misconduct investigations. For the first time, ordinary citizens would have a say in how officers were disciplined. It wasn't perfect. Some critics argued that the board lacked real power, but it was a start. Michelle celebrated the victory, knowing it was just one step toward bigger goals. Next came mandatory anti-racism training for all members of the police department. At first, many officers resisted, claiming they didn't need lessons on fairness or respect. Some even walked out of sessions grumbling about political correctness. But Michelle refused to let their resistance derail the program. She worked closely with trainers to ensure the curriculum was meaningful and impactful, incorporating real-life examples of systemic racism and its effects. By the end of the training sessions, even some skeptics admitted they had learned something valuable. One of the most significant victories came when the city agreed to implement body cameras for every officer. Previously, only a handful of cops wore them, and footage was often deleted or tampered with before investigations could begin. Now, every interaction between police and civilians would be recorded and accessible to the public upon request. Michelle pushed hard for this reform, believing transparency was key to rebuilding trust. When the first batch of body cameras arrived, she stood alongside community leaders at a press conference, holding one up triumphantly. "This isn't just technology," she said. "This is accountability. This is justice." But not everyone was happy about the changes. Within the precinct, tensions simmered. Many officers felt attacked, as though they were being painted as villains simply for wearing a badge. Anonymous messages popped up online, accusing Michelle of trying to destroy law enforcement altogether. Some even suggested she hated cops, a claim that couldn't have been further from the truth. Michelle respected good officers who genuinely wanted to serve their communities. What she opposed was abuse of power and the systems that protected it. Still, the backlash stung. Every insult, every accusation reminded her of the uphill battle she faced. Meanwhile, Michelle's story continued to spread beyond the city limits. National news outlets picked up on the movement, praising her courage and leadership. Talk show hosts invited her to share her experiences, while celebrities tweeted their support. One morning, Michelle woke up to find her face splashed across the cover of a major magazine with the headline, "The Woman Who Took Down a Corrupt Precinct." She stared at the image for a long moment, feeling both proud and overwhelmed. This wasn't what she had set out to do. It had started as a personal quest for justice, but now it was so much bigger than her. With national attention came new opportunities and new challenges. People from other cities reached out, asking Michelle for advice on how to tackle similar issues in their own communities. Activists invited her to speak at conferences and rallies, hoping her story would inspire others to take action. At first, Michelle hesitated. She didn't see herself as a leader or an expert. She was just someone doing what she believed was right. But the more she talked to people, the more she realized her voice mattered. If sharing her experience could help even one person stand up against injustice, then it was worth it. However, the spotlight also brought scrutiny. Critics began dissecting every word Michelle said, looking for flaws or contradictions. Some accused her of seeking fame, despite the fact that she had never asked for any of this. Others questioned whether her catering business was suffering because of her activism. It wasn't, at least not yet. But Michelle knew the criticism was meant to distract her from the real issues. Through it all, she stayed focused, reminding herself why she had started this journey in the first place. One particularly challenging moment came during a live television interview. The host, clearly skeptical of Michelle's motives, asked her point blank, "Do you think defunding the police is the answer? Or are you just trying to stir up trouble?" Michelle took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not here to stir up trouble," she replied calmly. "I'm here to hold people accountable. Defunding doesn't mean abolishing. It means reallocating resources to areas that truly benefit our communities, like education, mental health services, and affordable housing. We can't keep throwing money at problems without addressing the root causes. That's not sustainable." Her response earned applause from viewers, but it also sparked heated debates online. Some praised her clarity and conviction, while others dismissed her as naive or radical. Michelle ignored the noise, focusing instead on the work that needed to be done. Back home, the movement showed no signs of slowing down. Protesters remained outside the precinct, keeping the pressure on officials to honor their commitments. Lawyers reviewed case after case, identifying patterns of misconduct and filing lawsuits where necessary. Former officers continued to come forward, adding fuel to the fire. Each revelation brought the precinct closer to collapse and closer to rebuilding itself from the ground up. One evening, Michelle received a call from Marcus Reed, her lawyer. His tone was urgent but excited. "We've got something big," he said. An internal memo leaked from the precinct. It shows that supervisors have been actively covering up complaints for years, including ones involving Officer Dawson. "This is the smoking gun we've been waiting for." Michelle's heart raced. She immediately arranged a meeting with Sarah Collins, the journalist who had been covering the story from the beginning. Together they pored over the memo, analyzing every detail. It confirmed everything Michelle had suspected. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. Supervisors had falsified reports, destroyed evidence, and intimidated witnesses to protect their colleagues. The memo listed names, dates, and specific incidents, leaving no room for denial. Within days, Sarah published an explosive article exposing the memo's contents. The fallout was immediate. City officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, calling emergency meetings to discuss next steps. Several high-ranking officers were placed on leave, while others resigned outright. Protesters cheered, the developments chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace" and "Expose the lies." For Michelle, the leak marked a turning point. It proved that her instincts had been right all along, that the problem wasn't just a few bad apples but an entire system designed to protect them. With this new evidence in hand, she intensified her efforts, demanding not only accountability, but systemic change. She called for independent auditors to review the precinct's operations, ensuring nothing was hidden from public view. She pushed for legislation that would make it easier to sue departments for misconduct. And she advocated for hiring practices that prioritized diversity, arguing that representation mattered. As momentum grew, Michelle found herself facing another challenge: burnout. Between running her business, organizing protests, and attending meetings, she barely had time to breathe. Her employees noticed the toll it was taking on her: dark circles under her eyes, skipped meals, missed deadlines. They offered to take on extra responsibilities, but Michelle insisted she was fine. Deep down, though, she wondered if she was spreading herself too thin. Could she really sustain this level of commitment indefinitely? Despite her doubts, Michelle refused to give up. She reminded herself of the people counting on her, the families torn apart by wrongful arrests, the victims of brutality who had nowhere else to turn, the young activists inspired by her example. Their voices echoed in her mind, urging her to keep going. And so she did. One night, as Michelle sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers and notes, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. How had she gotten here? Just months ago, she had been an ordinary businesswoman delivering food orders and supporting her community in small ways. Now she was leading a movement capable of shaking the foundations of power. It was surreal, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. But as overwhelming as it felt, Michelle knew she wouldn't trade this experience for anything. For the first time in her life, she truly understood the meaning of purpose. This wasn't just about her. It was about creating a better future for everyone. And as long as there was work to be done, she would keep fighting. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Michelle. The leaked memo had ignited a firestorm of outrage, forcing city officials to act decisively. What started as a local issue had now become a national conversation about police reform, with Michelle at the center of it all. Her name was mentioned in headlines alongside civil rights icons, and her face appeared on billboards and magazine covers. Yet despite the growing fame, Michelle remained grounded. She reminded herself daily that this fight wasn't about recognition. It was about justice. As investigations into the precinct deepened, more shocking revelations came to light. Auditors uncovered years of financial mismanagement, including funds earmarked for community programs being funneled into unnecessary equipment purchases. Internal memos revealed secret quotas for arrests, pressuring officers to target marginalized groups regardless of actual crime rates. Dozens of victims stepped forward, sharing stories of abuse and neglect that painted a devastating picture of systemic failure. Each new detail fueled public anger, keeping the pressure on officials to deliver meaningful change. Finally, after months of hearings, reviews, and negotiations, the city announced sweeping reforms aimed at dismantling the corrupt culture within the precinct. Officers involved in misconduct were suspended or fired, including several high-ranking supervisors implicated in the cover-ups. A new leadership team was brought in, tasked with rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community. Training programs were revamped to emphasize empathy, de-escalation, and cultural sensitivity. Most importantly, the Civilian Review Board gained real authority, ensuring that future complaints would be taken seriously. For Michelle, these changes felt like vindication, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Reforming a broken system wasn't like flipping a switch. It required constant vigilance and effort. Old habits died hard, and there were still plenty of skeptics who doubted whether anything would truly improve. Some residents worried that the new policies were just window dressing, designed to placate protesters without addressing deeper issues. Others feared retaliation from officers who resented the changes. Michelle listened to their concerns, promising, to stay involved and hold leaders accountable. To ensure transparency, Michelle helped launch a community oversight initiative. Volunteers worked alongside auditors to monitor the precinct's progress, tracking everything from arrest records to complaint resolutions. Monthly town hall meetings provided a platform for residents to voice their opinions directly to officials. These gatherings weren't always smooth. Emotions often ran high and disagreements sometimes erupted into shouting matches, but they were essential for fostering dialogue. Michelle moderated many of these sessions using her calm demeanor and sharp wit to keep discussions productive. Her role as a mediator earned her even more respect. People began seeing her not just as an activist, but as a bridge builder, someone capable of uniting opposing sides around common goals. Local schools invited her to speak to students about resilience and leadership. Nonprofits sought her advice on tackling inequality in other sectors. Even some former critics softened their stance, acknowledging the positive impact her work was having. One retired officer admitted during a town hall meeting that he had initially dismissed Michelle's campaign as anti-police propaganda, but after witnessing the reforms firsthand, he now believed she had saved the department from itself. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some officers quit rather than adapt to the new policies, complaining that their jobs had become impossible. Others resisted quietly, dragging their feet on implementing reforms or finding loopholes to exploit. Anonymous threats against Michelle continued, though she refused to let them intimidate her. Instead, she hired security guards to protect her, business and home, vowing not to let fear dictate her actions. The strain of balancing activism with her catering company began to show. Orders piled up, deadlines slipped, and Michelle found herself working late nights just to keep up. Her employees tried to help, but even they couldn't compensate for the hours she spent attending meetings, giving interviews, and organizing protests. Customers noticed the decline in service and started taking their business elsewhere. For the first time, Michelle wondered if she could sustain both roles indefinitely. One evening, as she sat alone in her office surrounded by unpaid bills and half-finished invoices, Michelle broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the mountain of responsibilities weighing her down. She loved her business. It was her dream, her legacy. But she also loved the movement she had built. How could she choose between the two? Then her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Reed. "You've done enough. Let us handle things for a while." His words struck a chord. Michelle realized she didn't have to shoulder the burden alone. Over the next few days, she delegated tasks to trusted allies, empowering others to take charge where needed. Activists stepped up to organize protests. Lawyers handled legal filings, and volunteers managed the oversight initiative. Slowly but surely, Michelle began reclaiming pieces of her life. With renewed energy, she focused on expanding her reach beyond the city. Inspired by her success, activists in neighboring towns launched similar campaigns, demanding accountability from their own police departments. Michelle traveled across the country, speaking at conferences and rallies, sharing her story and offering guidance. Wherever she went, she emphasized the importance of grassroots organizing and persistence. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she often said. "It takes time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But if you stay committed, you can move mountains." Her message resonated deeply, sparking a wave of activism nationwide. Cities large and small began adopting versions of the reforms implemented in her hometown. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency and reducing racial profiling. Social media buzzed with hashtags like accountability nationwide and justice for all cities, connecting people fighting for the same cause. Michelle watched it all unfold with pride, knowing her efforts had sparked something much bigger than she ever imagined. Back home, the transformation of the precinct became undeniable. Arrest rates dropped significantly, especially among minority communities. Complaints of misconduct plummeted, replaced by glowing testimonials from residents who praised officers for their professionalism and kindness. The Civilian Review Board successfully resolved disputes without bias, earning widespread trust. Even former critics admitted that the changes had made the city safer and fairer for everyone. Michelle marked the one-year anniversary of her traffic stop with a celebration at the community center. Hundreds of people attended, including politicians, activists, and ordinary citizens. As she stood on stage addressing the crowd, Michelle reflected on how far they had come. What had started as a moment of humiliation had grown into a movement capable of transforming an entire system. It wasn't perfect, there was still work to be done, but it was proof that ordinary people could make extraordinary change. "We did this together," Michelle said, her voice filled with emotion. "Not me alone, but all of us. Every person who marched, every family who shared their story, every volunteer who gave their time, all of us made this possible. And we're not done yet. There are still injustices to fight, still voices to lift up, so let's keep going." The audience erupted in applause, cheering loudly as Michelle raised her fist in triumph. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel hopeful, not just for her city, but for the entire nation. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and she knew it wouldn't stop anytime soon. That night, as Michelle drove home under a sky full of stars, she smiled to herself. The road ahead would still be challenging, but she no longer felt alone. She had built a movement, inspired countless others, and proven that courage could topple even the strongest walls of injustice. Whatever came next, she was ready. 2 years after that fateful traffic stop, Michelle Carter stood on a stage unlike any she had ever imagined. She was no longer just a caterer or an activist. She was a symbol of resilience, courage, and hope. The event was held in a grand auditorium packed with thousands of people, activists, politicians, students, journalists, and everyday citizens who had been touched by her story. Cameras flashed as Michelle accepted an award for outstanding community leadership, a recognition long overdue, though she never sought it. As she gazed out at the sea of faces, she felt a mix of emotions: pride, gratitude, and a quiet sense of fulfillment. The journey hadn't been easy. There were days when Michelle doubted herself, when the weight of the fight threatened to crush her spirit. Threats and criticism followed her everywhere, and balancing her business with activism often left her exhausted. But through it all, she remained steadfast, driven by the belief that one person could make a difference. And now, standing here, she saw proof of that belief reflected in the eyes of everyone around her. The transformation of the precinct was complete, or as close to complete as it could be. Once a symbol of corruption and abuse, it was now a model for reform nationwide. Officers underwent rigorous training programs designed to eliminate bias and promote accountability. Body cameras became mandatory, with footage reviewed regularly by civilian oversight boards. Arrest rates among minority communities dropped dramatically, replaced by initiatives focused on rehabilitation and support. Residents who once feared police interactions now approached them with cautious optimism, knowing they had allies rather than adversaries. Michelle's influence extended far beyond her hometown. Her story inspired similar movements in cities across the country. Activists adopted her strategies, combining grassroots organizing, legal action, and media exposure to hold their own police departments accountable. Some even reached out directly to Michelle for advice, and she welcomed them with open arms. Whether through phone calls, emails, or face-to-face meetings, she shared her experiences freely, encouraging others to adapt her methods to fit their unique challenges. Her efforts also caught the attention of national leaders. Lawmakers invited her to testify before Congress, where she spoke passionately about systemic racism and the need for comprehensive reform. Her testimony moved many to tears, prompting bipartisan support for legislation aimed at increasing transparency and reducing inequality in law enforcement. When the bill passed months later, Michelle watched from the gallery, overcome with emotion. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and progress was worth celebrating. Despite her growing fame, Michelle never lost sight of her roots. Her catering business, though strained during the height of her activism, rebounded stronger than ever thanks to loyal customers and new supporters eager to patronize her company. She hired additional staff, including several former volunteers from the movement, and expanded her services to include workshops on leadership and advocacy. These sessions combined cooking demonstrations with lessons on teamwork, communication, and perseverance, skills Michelle believed were essential for success both in business and life. One of Michelle's proudest achievements was the establishment of the Carter Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to empowering marginalized communities. Funded by donations and grants, the foundation provided resources for education, job training, and entrepreneurship programs. It also offered scholarships to young activists pursuing careers in social justice. Michelle poured her heart into the foundation, seeing it as a way to ensure her legacy would endure long after she stepped back from the spotlight. As time went on, Michelle began reflecting more on what she had accomplished. She realized that while she had started this journey seeking justice for herself, it had become so much bigger. It wasn't just about shutting down a corrupt precinct. It was about changing hearts and minds, challenging systems of oppression, and proving that ordinary people could create extraordinary change. Every milestone along the way, the leaked memo, the protests, the reforms, the awards, was a testament to the power of collective action. But Michelle knew the work wasn't finished. Racism and inequality were deeply ingrained in society, and dismantling them required constant effort. She often reminded herself and others that victories like hers were not endpoints, but stepping stones. "We've made progress," she would say during speeches, "but we can't afford to stop fighting. Justice isn't something you achieve once. It's something you build every single day." Even as she scaled back her direct involvement in activism, Michelle continued mentoring the next generation of leaders. She visited schools, colleges, and community centers, sharing her story and offering guidance to young people eager to make a difference. Many looked up to her as a role model, someone who refused to let adversity define her and instead used it as fuel for change. One high school student told her, "You showed me that I don't have to wait until I'm older to stand up for what's right. If you can do it, so can I." Those words stayed with Michelle, reminding her why she had fought so hard in the first place. On weekends, Michelle often drove past the intersection where the racist officer had pulled her over. Each time she smiled, remembering how far she and her city had come since that day. What had once been a source of pain and humiliation was now a reminder of strength and triumph. The precinct nearby bore little resemblance to the institution it used to be. Its walls were adorned with murals created by local artists depicting themes of unity and justice. Officers greeted residents warmly, and children played freely in the park across the street, unafraid of those sworn to protect them. Michelle's personal life flourished too. She reconnected with old friends, spent more time with family, and even started dating again. For years, her focus had been solely on the movement, leaving little room for anything else. Now, she allowed herself moments of joy and relaxation, savoring the simple pleasures of life. Cooking remained her favorite pastime, and she often joked that running a catering business had prepared her well for feeding crowds of protesters and volunteers. In interviews, Michelle was frequently asked what advice she would give to others facing injustice. Her answer was always the same: don't stay silent. Speak up, speak loud, and keep speaking until someone listens. Find your tribe, people who believe in your cause and will stand by you no matter what. And most importantly, never underestimate the power of persistence. Change doesn't happen overnight, but if you keep pushing, eventually the dam will break. Years later, when historians wrote about this era of civil rights activism, Michelle's name appeared prominently alongside other trailblazers. Books were written about her journey. Documentaries chronicled her impact and statues were erected in her honor. Schools and community centers bore her name, ensuring future generations would remember her contributions. Yet despite all the accolades, Michelle remained humble. She often said, "I didn't do this alone. None of us does anything alone. It takes a village to create change, and I was lucky enough to have an incredible village behind me." Looking back on her life, Michelle felt immense gratitude, not just for the victories, but for the struggles that shaped her. That traffic stop had been a defining moment, yes, but it was her response to it that truly defined her. She had turned pain into purpose, shame into strength, and silence into action. In doing so, she proved that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite it. And so, Michelle Carter's story became more than just a tale of triumph over adversity. It became a blueprint for anyone daring to challenge injustice, a reminder that even the smallest acts of defiance could spark monumental change. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Michelle smiled contentedly. The road ahead would still be long, but she knew the world was moving in the right direction, and she had helped pave the way.